I'll get us started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Cantrell. I am KEJC's employment law attorney, and Miranda and I and Rich coordinate and plan these workers' rights task force meetings, and we want to welcome you to this one. I think we had a legislative update by phone earlier this year, and this would have been after the legislative session, our first typical, more in-person meeting of the year, and we all know that everything's happening here these days. And the good news about that is we have a record number of participants on this call. I really appreciate all of our legal aid folks who are not normally able to travel who are joining us for this call today, and of course appreciate our regular attendees as well. That's the good news. The bad news is we were gonna sort of do a thing where we check in with everyone and their organization and see how everyone's doing, because I know as worker advocates that our work has changed drastically over the last few months. The law has changed. I think some of our focus has shifted in a lot of our organizations, and the clients we're helping are presenting with different issues. And we're going to cover try to cover a lot of that in our meeting today, but we just really can't do the around the room sort of individual check-ins that we wanted. So I'm kind of bummed about that. But the great news is right now, you know, in person, we normally only have 20 to 30 people in the room, and right now we have 48 participants on the call, and we had as many as 70 registered. So people are going to be hopping on and off throughout the call, and that's great. We want you here. Stay as long as you can, and we also have some time for you all to chat later after the full meeting adjourns if you want to utilize that. If you want to utilize the chat function to send messages back and forth, we're going to be monitoring that. If you want to send questions and you want me to ask your question to the presenter and you don't want to go off mute, I'm happy to do that as well. But really just welcome, and be thinking about, we do have some time, even though we're not talking to everyone and having everyone introduce themselves like we normally do. We do have time later in the meeting for announcements. So if you do have a lot of if your program's making a lot of changes or has a special initiative or meeting that you want to announce, be thinking about that, because you will have time to announce that later. The first announcement that we wanted to make was from Ben, and we're glad Ben's here with us. We're going to be talking about, I think, a lot of new initiatives and a lot of programs related to the virus. And the one that we wanted to focus on sort of as a legal aid type organization is an initiative called Together Lawyers Can. And we put Ben on the agenda specifically to talk about it, so I'm not going to talk about it, but it's a great program, and I think it's very well-intentioned in coming together to really help folks when the courts open back up after this. So Ben, do you want to talk about that more?
Sure. I can talk briefly about the initiative. I'm a little intimidated to see so many very, very good labor attorneys on here who can talk more eloquently about this than I can. But here's what I'll say. You know, the 4 legal aid organizations have started this program to incentivize through free online CLE credits lawyers to help during this time of crisis. Everybody's wondering what they can do, and I have to admit I feel a little bit silly sitting on my hands at home while, you know, brave medical workers go and actually help people on the front lines of these things. And this is sort of the lawyer equivalent of that, as far as I can tell. This is a way for lawyers to be helpful during this time. And what we're working on first is unemployment. We all know that there have been a lot of delays in the rollout of unemployment insurance benefits due to antiquated systems, and also just radically expanded categories of eligibility, and trying to incorporate all of those categories into old systems, and, you know, dramatically increased call volume as well, right? So it's sort of a perfect storm for delays on the front end of things. But what we want these pro bono attorneys to really help with is helping people get the benefits that they need when they're questioned, but also on the back end of all this, there are all sorts of new ways that people can keep unemployment insurance benefits even when their workplaces are open back up, if it's not safe or feasible for them to return to the workplace. And unfortunately, allowing workers to do that requires a fact-specific inquiry into what their specific situations are, what their family situation is, what their work situation is, what their family's health situation is, all of that. And there just aren't enough legal aid attorneys in the entire nation to help all of the Kentuckians that are going to need help. And so we're going to need help from pro bono attorneys. And it's the kind of work that, with help from the legal aids who have developed these CLEs, that attorneys who don't have a ton of experience in the administrative appeals process or even unemployment insurance, legal aids are going to get you up to speed on that. So the real ask here is, if you're an attorney on the call and you haven't signed up, sign up. And we need everyone on the call to peer pressure your lawyer friends to be a helper right now and say, hey, I heard about this program. I'm sure you've already signed up for it, because obviously you want to help as much as possible during this time. It's not just going to be for UI. That's what it is for now, but we're also going to use it. I think the plan is to pivot or expand as well into eviction assistance. So this is really the portal for lawyers to get involved in the assistance. And so that's the message that we want people to hear. So if you can share it on social media, email lawyers specifically. We know a direct ask is more effective than just putting it out into the ether on Facebook. You want to tag your friends and say, I'm sure you've already signed up, but just in case you haven't, do it and share it with your friends as well.
Ben, do you see Professor Levinson's question? Is there a way for law students and unlicensed Kentucky attorneys to help?
That is a good question. I would say law students are probably the kind of folks who can help at legal aid organizations themselves in whatever way. Maybe people need calls back, or I'll leave it to the legal aids to figure out what the actual work is. But I don't want to turn law students or other help away. And if legal aids want to turn that help away, they certainly can, because certainly there's overhead in getting people up to speed. But that impulse is the right impulse. I would just say, let's talk to the local legal aids.
And I would say there are, provisionally licensed students, third years under that Supreme Court rule. And if one of the law school programs providing clinic type services using those types of attorneys wanted to pivot and get involved, I could definitely see a path for that.
Good point.
Do we have any other questions for Ben about Together Lawyers Can? He's put up the link, and everyone who's a licensed attorney should have gotten an email through the Bar Association maybe 2 weeks ago, and I signed up, and that gives you sort of a portal to the CLEs, and some of the people on this call have actually done some of the CLEs on administrative law and UI hearings. So that's good information no matter what, and you get CLE credit for it. So go ahead and sign up.
And I would just say, I'm not the only person on this call that knows about Together Lawyers Can or has been on some of the organizing calls. So if I left anything out or needs clarification or just addition, feel free to weigh in.
So we're gonna move on in the agenda, and Miranda sent out the agenda yesterday, I believe, so you can follow along in the agenda. It's probably no surprise to anyone here that we are going to be discussing unemployment insurance, and who isn't discussing unemployment insurance these days? I know that when all of this happened, I do not exclusively practice unemployment insurance. Mostly that I practice wage and hour, And, all of a sudden, all of us are UI experts. And I know that in my various roles and all the hats that I wear, I have been called upon a lot to answer questions about UI. And I know probably a lot of other people on this call have as well. So we wanted to give you all an update, and we're going to do it on a couple different levels. We want to talk about some Kentucky specific data, and we want to talk about the new CARES Act provisions and sort of the different benefits and levels that came through that legislation. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more. Ben mentioned the why behind Together Lawyers Can, and I think we're going to talk about some issues that folks are seeing, or whether folks are seeing issues about employers disputing UI claims, and whether we are going to see sort of a massive or at least an uptick in those hearings, and need to be prepared to defend workers in those. So Dustin, are you ready to get started? Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, and Miranda, am I able to share my screen? Let's see. Oh, yes, I am. Okay. I have put together some slides because that's how we roll at KCEP. For those of you who don't know me, I see a lot of familiar faces on this call, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dustin Pugel. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based out of Berea, and we work on state budget and tax issues, but other policy issues as they come up, and obviously unemployment insurance is a big one. So yeah, when I was talking to Miranda earlier this week, she just wanted me to kind of give an overview of what has changed recently with unemployment insurance, what's sort of the current state of play as far as the numbers go, and what are some of the sort of big issues that we're facing moving forward. So I'm going to try and go through this quickly because I'm guessing a lot of folks are pretty familiar with a lot of what's happened recently, and I don't want to hold up too much of that time. So just to kind of give a overview of what is happening with the data right now. I mean, we, as everybody here knows, have seen just an unbelievable, previously unimaginable spike in unemployment insurance claims. This little peak here, this was the worst part of the Great Recession, when we had about 25,000 claims. The highest in our state's history is 30,000 claims. At the peak of the COVID-19 downturn, we had 117,000, and it's remained elevated since then. You know, the first couple times we put this chart up, people thought that like maybe our mouse slipped or something, like there was just, or that there was an axis, you know, on the wrong side. But it really has been that dramatic and that intense. Now, the numbers are starting to come back down. They've been dropping for the last 4 weeks, but we're still at 47,000 claims, which is almost 2 times higher than the worst part of the Great Recession. For the last several weeks, we've had around 250,000 continued claims, which are folks who have asked for more than one check or more than 1 week's worth of checks, which is kind of strange. And I'll come back to that, but you know, we would think that that would be higher because since March 21st, there have been almost 800,000 people who have filed initial claims. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 40% of our total non-farm jobs in the state, which again is just unheard of. New jobs numbers came out today that showed that our unemployment rate is around 14.7%. It's likely much higher than that based off the way they ask it and when they ask it. I think, you know, this number gives us a much closer idea of what we're actually looking at in the economy. So again, just to quickly recap for folks who want a reminder, you know, there were some important provisions in the Coronavirus Response Act that the House passed early in March. A lot of money for new administration, technical assistance for work sharing programs, emergency grants for high unemployment states, which are basically all of them now, and then full federal funding for extended UI benefits, which are, you know, past 26 weeks. And then the CARES Act really ramped that up and created some pretty unprecedented programs. The first is the pandemic unemployment compensation, which, you know, everyone I think just refers to as the $600 a week. And that's what it is. It's essentially an extra $600 a week for unemployment insurance and pandemic unemployment assistance, as long as the individual is receiving at least $1 of either of those programs. An important thing to point out here, I think, is that is important for people to be able to afford their bills. It's also just really important to make sure we stave off other layoffs, because we want to make sure that there's enough aggregate demand that people can continue to sell stuff, continue to be employed, and we don't kind of spiral into a depression, essentially, where layoffs sort of beget layoffs. The second is pandemic emergency unemployment compensation. This is an extra 13 weeks of unemployment insurance after states have exhausted their regular UI benefits. So this is true for all claimants, not just the COVID-19 related joblessness. And again, that is also federally funded, which is really important because I think everyone's expecting our unemployment insurance trust fund to be exhausted here in the coming weeks or months. And then finally, pandemic unemployment assistance, which is essentially UI benefits for non-traditional workers. So freelancers, gig economy workers, part-time workers, people with spotty job histories, even people who anticipated employment this summer, basically had it in the bag, but then it was canceled. An example that was given to me by the state was a lifeguard who was employed in theory and on paper, but then when the pools closed, they weren't going to be able to take up that job. And then finally, there's full federal funding of the waiting week and as well as work sharing for states that had a pre-existing permanent work sharing program. For states that created a temporary one, it's 50% federal funding, which is still pretty good. So moving on, in Kentucky, right around that same time, we passed Senate Bill 150, which was actually a bill that would have banned surprise medical billing. But unfortunately, it got gutted because of where it was in the process, and they needed to use that. So hopefully we can see that bill come back next year. But it did some really important things in non-codified language, which means it's temporary. It's not going to be permanent, and it only lasts as long as the state of emergency lasts. But I think it really put some important values on paper around unemployment insurance that I hope we can build on legislatively in the future. So it waives the ability for work and work sharing requirements. It waives the waiting week, which of course showed up after the last Great Recession, and I think permanently needs to go away. It allows the state to adopt what's called an alternative base period, which is a really important measure for normal unemployment insurance benefits. It was probably a little less important after Congress passed pandemic unemployment assistance, because that picked up a lot of folks that would have normally been picked up under the ABP. It doesn't penalize businesses with 100 employees or less for their layoffs, meaning the tax, the FUTA for unemployment insurance benefits is experience rated. The more people you lay off, the higher the tax gets, and the more often you lay people off, the higher your tax gets. This essentially says for small businesses, we're not gonna do that. There are some other protections around COVID-19 related layoffs in federal legislation that again kind of makes this moot, but it's something that Kentucky lawmakers decided they wanted to put on paper, and I think that's important to remember. It expanded UI benefits for self-employed and employees not otherwise covered by employment insurance. Again, PUA kind of covered that. And then it also created a work sharing program. This is something the state has actually been working pretty diligently on. In fact, there are now emergency regs on the books to lay out what a work sharing program can look like here in Kentucky. Sometimes that's referred to as short time compensation. It's essentially where a business, through a managed process, can reduce hours for their employees instead of laying them off. And it has to be more than 10% of their hours, but less than 60% of their hours. And then unemployment insurance will come in and pick up part of the lost wages that result from lower hours. And that's really good for employers because they can retain their employees and not get penalized necessarily for reducing hours. But it's also good for the employees because they get to keep benefits like health insurance and retirement and so forth. So that program is not yet up and running, but it is something that they're working toward. and that we at least have a framework for in the regulations. And then SB 150 also gave future flexibility in case of changes at the national level. So folks have heard about the HEROES Act recently. There's a couple good unemployment insurance provisions in that bill. Right now, PUA is expected to, or is set to end by December 31st. This extends new applications for another month and allows existing claimants to continue to draw benefits through the end of March, which is really important. And then pandemic unemployment compensation, the extra $600, that's set to expire July 31st. But the HEROES Act would extend that also through January 31st of next year. So an extra 6 months of that $600 per week benefit. So I want to just shift over to a tool that we have put online that kind of just tracks the economic fallout of COVID-19 in Kentucky. And we look at several specific metrics to try and understand what's going on. And I realize this is kind of small, so let me try and zoom in a little bit for everybody. So the first one we track is weekly unemployment insurance claims. And I showed you that bar graph before, but this is a pretty neat little interactive that shows both continuing claims and initial claims going back to 2008 when the last spike hit. This yellow bar is continuing claims, and obviously it's very large compared to the initial claims. One thing I want to mention about this is we would actually typically think that the continuing claims would be much higher right now, considering all of the initial claims we've had up to this point. And that's been a little bit concerning in the data, as well as just anecdotally when we hear from folks that I'm sure that you all have been helping, that they're not getting their benefits. And, I think a lot of that comes down to the pandemic unemployment assistance claims. I think a lot of the UI claims themselves have been processed pretty well, and I think that's reflected in the governor's weekly press conference. But in data that came out last week and this week, again, this is kind of small, so I'll zoom in. The Department of Labor has provided data around pandemic unemployment assistance claims. And Kentucky, I'm sorry if you can't see very well, the last time Kentucky made any pandemic unemployment assistance claims was April 25th, which means that essentially for so far in the entirety of May, we have not made any PUA claims at all. And I don't know if that's a data issue or if that's actual, but it definitely matches up with sort of anecdotes that I've been hearing. And obviously that's incredibly concerning because I would believe that a large share of the 790,000 initial claims that we've seen up to this point are likely non-traditional, sort of payroll employees that would be insured under unemployment insurance and would probably qualify under PUA. So this is a really big problem that I haven't heard much from in the press conferences. I don't think we've heard much from in the out of the cabinet itself, but it's something that from folks I've talked to inside the cabinet, that they're aware there are issues and that they need to be moving quickly to address, because I think what we're going to see is a pretty big backlog. I mean, to put that into context, Massachusetts, which is a larger state, they've had over 1 million PUA claims, almost 1.2 million PUA claims, or they did in the week of May 16th, in 1 week. And other states, are also large. So I will add the link to this report in the notes when we're done, so you all can check that out, but as well as the economic tracker that we put together. But I do think this is one of the big problems that we're seeing right now with Kentucky's unemployment insurance system. One other thing I just wanted to point out, because it's new and kind of extreme, is that jobs numbers came out for Kentucky today as well. And these are all the jobs going back to 2000. So here's the 2001 recession. Here's the Great Recession. January 2009 was the trough. We lost 19,000 jobs. This was April. Again, that's not an axis. That is this is what a really life-saving and important stay-at-home order represented. And I think that's important to point out, because this was something that needed to happen. We needed to make sure that folks were healthy at home. But at the same time, I think when you hear the governor talk about what this means for revenues, when you hear about other groups saying, we need to make sure that our unemployment insurance system is working for folks and that we're making people whole, this is why. It's a really pretty radical number that we just don't have anything to compare to. So I will stop there and hand it back over to Mackenzie.
Dustin, thank you so much, and thank you especially for including the numbers from today's jobs report. I get that email too, and I used to never look at it, and now I wait for it with bated breath every Thursday morning. And does anybody have any other, James, thank you for answering Stephanie's question related to the alternative base period. I wanted to address a couple things that were brought up in Dustin's presentation before we move on. And one of those is we did invite someone, and I wish that he had been able to join. We did invite someone from the cabinet to join us this morning. And as you can imagine, they're a little busy over there. And I talked to a couple people over there, and I talked to JT Henderson, who's the communications person for the cabinet, and they wanted Josh Benton to be able to join us today. And I think a lot of you all, if you watch the governor's 5 o'clock briefings, recognize that name. He appears a lot in comments on the UI program. He was unavailable to join us today, but hopefully we can get him when things, maybe by the time our next meeting rolls around, if it settles down, maybe we can get someone from the cabinet to get into these numbers. Another thing that I'll mention is, because I didn't realize, and I think a lot of people on this call didn't realize based on what I'm seeing on the chat, what I've been hearing was they did a couple of big batch payments of the PUA payments. And that probably is that April 25th date that you cited, Dustin. I thought in sort of trying to clear a backlog, and I think I thought at the time that backlog was sort of over, and that everything was fixed and those payments were going to keep going after that backlog was cleared. So it's really good to know that that actually may not be the case, and they're going to have to keep clearing this up and clearing this up. My information is I'm aware of about 90,000 claimants who either for some reason there was a glitch in their filing. They maybe a part of one of those non-traditional groups and maybe didn't get it right the first time. Maybe they had a stop order based on a previous overpayment issue. A lot of a fraud potential flag from a previous claim, and some potential other issues that were coming up in their paperwork, and that's sort of the new backlog, so to speak. And those are the people mainly who I am talking to now, that they are having to go in one by one, the people who are calling and having a lot of issues. But also it will create issues if some of these people in April received payments and, like me, thought that the backlog was over and they were going to keep receiving payments, and now they're not receiving payments. Anybody have any comment on that, or know anything new? That's sort of what I'm hearing. And
I want to echo something that Ben said earlier too, because I don't want to leave it on that note, that there may be a data issue or there may be an actual processing issue. The cabinet has really put forward a heroic, sort of Herculean effort. They normally have months to be able to roll out one program, and in the last 2 months they've had essentially 4 new federal programs and 2 new state programs that they've had to try and develop and then deploy, all while hiring 1,200 people to run the phones and processing just like a bonkers number of claims. So, I am incredibly impressed with what they've been able to achieve up to this point. I just wanted to point that issue out because I know you are representing a lot of folks who are likely applying for PUA. And so far in the data, those in May have not shown up. And I think, that is something to flag.
That's a really great point. And we're all seeing things that we've never seen before, and doing things that they've never seen before. So yeah, they do deserve a lot of credit for that. If we want to move on for a second, we wanted to call on Cindy Millay from Legal Aid of the Bluegrass to talk about potential issues, or maybe like I said earlier, maybe an uptick in cases for employers who are challenging awards of UI during this time, and wanted to check in just generally with our legal aid programs to address this. So Cindy, are you ready?
I am, yes.
It's yours.
Thank you. Well, we really haven't seen a lot of denials yet. We anticipate seeing those mostly, as we've heard from other people. A lot of people are just still waiting in some sort of investigative limbo to hear about their benefits. If anyone out there has a backdoor number to reach somebody at the cabinet to try to figure out what's going on with a person's benefits, I'm sure that all of the legal aid programs would appreciate that, so that those of us on intake, when we're talking to a client, can call in and try to find out what the holdup is, or what piece of information the cabinet may need from that person to get their benefits. Early on denials, I think the governor's covered, there were a lot of denials going out for non-traditional UI seekers who normally wouldn't be eligible for unemployment. But I think most of those have been resolved. I think possible denials in the future would be, I talked to a gentleman yesterday who quit his job at Lowe's, or not quit, but he had a doctor's note and said he can't work because he's at high risk and he can't get his unemployment benefits right now. He doesn't know why, but I anticipate that it's going to be a denial based on either voluntary quit, since the employer is providing PPE and some accommodations to keep the employees safe, or able and available to work. I think that those are going to be the two issues that are going to come up with people not going back to work, or not, finding a job because of coronavirus concerns. And although I think there are protections built into the CARES Act that allow people to decline to go back to work for those reasons, I think those are why we're going to get some denials. One of my questions is, if you are saying I can't go back to work because of a COVID related reason, when you're filling out your claim for benefits, should the person claim they're able and available to work, or not claim that they're able and available to work? I think if they click not able and available to work, that could kick them into a denial box. So I think, a lot of the as you said, Mackenzie, a lot of the denials are not really denials, but just, investigative limbo cases are because somebody clicked the wrong box, or somebody didn't provide one piece of information. So I think that is an issue. Because of that, anybody that calls our office, I recommend we appeal all denials, and at least do the commission level. It's free to the client and to us, except for our time, to either assist them or to give them advice. And at least we would get some more insight from the referee decision as to what they're relying on to deny people, to be able to argue that to the commission that that was a wrongful denial. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Cindy. I'll respond to a couple of things that you've said. When you're talking about a backdoor contact within the cabinet, I know some of us have tried to get sort of an official liaison for legal aid attorneys through the cabinet and haven't quite been successful there yet. I can tell you, you know, I've handled about as many unemployment claims and issues as a state legislator as I have as an employment attorney. From people who have called me, you know, using both hats. We do have a legislative liaison within the cabinet who we forward our cases directly to, and they are addressing them, and they're addressing them fairly quickly and, you know, to the extent that they can. So I've told a lot of people to contact their state legislator, and you know, I've had varying success with that on my own. And the other thing I wanted to sort of touch upon is when you talked about potential denials and encouraging everyone to appeal and the ease of that, I certainly agree with you. And I wanted to just bring us back around and talk about that, sort of why we're doing the Together Lawyers Can. And these hearings are administrative hearings. They're held over the phone. And compared to evictions, which we're going to see an uptick on when the courts reopen and those filings are processed again, with these administrative hearings, you know, you're not going to court. Any attorney in the state could jump on a telephone call like we're on right now and help a worker address their unemployment with a referee. So the difference between, you know, getting involved in an eviction case, for example, and having to go to court with the client in the county where they live is there's a lot more ease to helping someone with unemployment. So I just wanted to point that out and bring us back around before we move on. We have had a couple of questions come through, and we're going to move on just a little bit because some of the questions that we've seen actually are going to be really apropos for our next topic. And if you were on the call before we got started, Gretchen and I were talking, and Gretchen, I think this all happened at a really good time. Gretchen emailed us and said, you know, we have to talk about what the disproportionate impact of immigrant workers and people of color and what's going on at the ground. If some of you might know this, Miranda and KJC and I have gotten a grant where we are doing more wage consultations in Louisville, and we're working with La Casita Center, and we were just getting this off the ground when the virus hit. And so we've personally seen a lot of how this issue is affecting and how it affected faster and harder, I think, immigrant workers. And Gretchen's now at the Backside Learning Center, and I'm really interested to hear what's been going on there, especially since horse racing has resumed and the Backside's a little more active. I drive by there and can sort of see more activity. There's a lot to talk about here. So Gretchen, I'll let you go ahead and get started and bring in whoever you want to leap in on this conversation, because it's definitely one worth having.
Super. Thank you, Mackenzie. And my apologies, my internet, like all of ours, is really iffy. And so I got bumped off Zoom. And my husband, John Young, who's at Legal Aid in Louisville, so shout out to all the legal aid lawyers, has the coveted spot by the router because he has Zoom court at 11:30. So as much as I'd want to see your faces, I did just a minute ago. So it's really good to see all of you justice warriors out there. For those of you who don't know, just by explanation, I am at the Backside Learning Center, but I am an attorney. I'm not doing legal work right now, but have done work in immigration and with victims' rights and working with issues of justice in that way. So it's good to see many of your faces. And I really just want to underscore what Mackenzie said, that I really think that all of our discussions, whether they are about data, policy, legal assistance, outreach, really need to center the margins. And using that expression, which is not my own, but it is that we have to integrate concerns of, you know, race and immigration status really in every intervention we're doing from the start. And so one of the things, I'm outside of the administration, I I did work for now Governor, then Attorney General Andy Beshear. I'm very close to folks in the administration, but I will say that despite them doing a really good job navigating this crisis, I do feel like it's still a lesson for us that we need to really center these issues of marginalized communities from the get-go, or else we're playing catch up. So I just want to explain what I mean by that. Let me also explain, I work for the Backside Learning Center, which is an independent nonprofit located on the backside of Churchill Downs Racetrack. I by no means am speaking for Churchill Downs, I'm speaking just for our nonprofit. We are primarily an educational and social service organization, and we assist 1,000 workers who work on the backside of Churchill Downs who are majority immigrants, who are mostly from Mexico and Guatemala. We also provide programming and assistance for their families and kids. So, you know, our population is definitely representative of the folks who are immigrants who really occupy a lot of the essential worker roles. People who don't have the luxury of things like sick days and, you know, backup resources, don't have a lot of, you know, privileges to start with, or I would say necessities to start with. So when you're looking at navigating this crisis, which is a work crisis, a economic survival crisis, a health crisis, our folks are particularly vulnerable. In addition to being mostly immigrants, they're also migrant workers. So the horse industry depends on workers following the horses who travel from region to region following the racing calendar. So on May 11th, when the racetrack opened up, first of all, racing should have opened up 2 months prior at Churchill. So you had people who had missed any income for 2 months. Secondly, when they came back on May 11th, they were trickling in from multiple locations, from Louisiana, Florida, Arkansas. Some people had been in New York. So people were coming from all different places and coming back. There are 600 people who live on the backside, 300 in a dorm that's very bare bones, 2 to a room, and others live in apartments on top of horse barns or even in small rooms next to the stables. So pretty bare bones, minimal housing. So people were returning back. So a few of the things that we were immediately sort of aware of, and keep in mind, we are an education program. We do ESL classes, we do tutoring for kids, we do some social service navigation, but we are not primarily an advocacy organization. You know, Churchill provides our building that we're housed in. We play a supportive role, but we're really kind of a unique nonprofit. That being said, we were trying to raise our voices to advocate for the needs of our workers to the extent that we could. So I did have conversations with Caitlin Blair, who's going to talk to you all more, but we were really trying to make sure that as many safeguards were in place for this population. People work 7 days a week. They are not employees of Churchill Downs. They are basically, you know, employees of the trainers who individually rent the barns on the backside of Churchill Downs. So you have 47 barns, double that amount usually of trainers, and people are working independently for those folks. So by safeguarding their health, we just wanted to make sure that as many things were in place to try to work on safety. So Churchill, you know, when people came back, they had to have an extensive plan. Everybody was COVID tested, including our staff, to get onto the backside. No one's allowed on the backside. There's daily temperature checks. There's recommendation that people wear masks. But I will say that we have stepped into a sort of public health advocacy role because we are getting donated masks and passing them out. It's clear that folks still need additional support. Couple other concerns, just if folks haven't been following the data, there's a lot of concerning parts about the impact of COVID on immigrant communities for a number of reasons. So I think language access has been a huge gap. That's one of the things that I wish was sort of mainstreamed from the start. So messaging and culturally competent ways of getting out that messaging were needed. You know, upwards of 90% or more of our families had no internet service or laptops in the home. So people were getting, messages on their phone, but they might not be accessing as much on the computer. Even when you think about things like unemployment applications, people really have a lot of access issues. Secondly, in terms of messaging, we are seeing a lot of concerning non-compliance, families gathering, people having social gatherings still. And I think part of that is just due to people not getting the messages as much. In terms of data, but going back to this, Latinos are about 4%, 3 to 4% of Kentucky's population, but COVID cases are over 13%. Not seeing the alarming disproportionate death rate as we are in our African American communities, but it still is pretty alarming when you look at that disproportionate impact of who's, relative to their population size. And so in the South End, where we are located, there seems to be a lot of spread. And we, of course, are sort of crossing our fingers that the close-knit, residential setting of Churchill backside does not result in an outbreak, because that's very concerning. So lastly, I just wanted to highlight for you all some of the gaps. I hate that I can't see your faces because I would ask everybody to raise their hands, but one of the huge gaps for immigrant communities, even among communities of color, is the disproportionate impact of lack of monetary assistance. So, a lot of our immigrant workers, like most immigrant workers in the United States, in quote unquote unskilled or low skilled labor, are undocumented, and most of them don't qualify for unemployment. Even our mixed status families under the CARES Act. So if you have a U.S. citizen mom who's married to an undocumented immigrant, that whole family is ineligible for CARES Act stimulus money. So big gaps. And even in our compassionate Louisville City with the One Louisville Fund, the way that that fund was set up, where families and people could apply for up to $1,000 cash assistance if they had been economically hurt by COVID, like losing their job, undocumented immigrants were really excluded from that, although they were not stated to be excluded from that funding, which was not government funding, it was private funding through a foundation. The application required that they make a verbal statement that they were undocumented and that would go in a database. And most of us who have any background in immigration law, we're saying there's no way, A, our clients would ever do that, and B, that we would ever advise them to do that, because in this day and age, it would be very vulnerable to have that information in a public government database. So our folks, are really hard hit by this. In the horse racing industry, they were out of work for several months, no income, not eligible for unemployment assistance, not getting that federal stimulus, not getting insurance. So as a result, they've really fallen through the gaps. And that's why agencies like ours have really stepped in to try to fill that need. And so we have pivoted to provide emergency food assistance. We have worked with other partners, including La Casita, Americana, Adelante Hispanic Achievers, and some faith communities that serve Latino communities, along with some generous donors, including the CENS Foundation, to create what's called Colectivo Esperanza Fund, Collective Hope Fund, where we have distributed through our organizations $1,000 stimulus directly to families impacted. It is not money that is earmarked whereby you have to say you have to apply this to rent or whatever else. We trust that people will make good decisions and the best decisions for their own family's needs, but trying to fill that gap for emergency assistance. So I guess the takeaways would be really important to center immigrant and refugee communities in all of our interventions to the extent that we can. Language access is a big part of that. Any messaging that can be done, also look at low literacy. So any radio or video is a really good way to get that out. Recognize the disproportionate impact of this disease, and the lack of access to financial assistance is really, really vital. Continue to prioritize testing for these communities. And ultimately, this is all in our self-interest. I don't want to go into an economic policy argument, but immigrant workers are absolutely essential for our recovery and our sustained growth. You know, I've just talked about the horse racing industry, but look at CNAs, look at healthcare industry, and that's really dependent on these, as well as the restaurant industry, food service, food picking, all of that. So that's what I have right now. Tried to keep it in my time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Incidentally, we definitely always love having lawyers connect with us. So if lawyers are interested ever in volunteering or have creative ideas for how to get information to our workers, that would be great. And lastly, I meant to do this at the beginning, but I'm really thrilled that my Bingham Fellows colleague, Min's son, is on this call. Min is an incredible resource in the Louisville community. She is a leader in the Korean community. She's an entrepreneur. She's a medical interpreter, has been on the front lines, and has been doing a lot of advocacy, and is a tremendous resource. And so I'm just really glad that Min is also on this call, because she's seen a lot of some of these same gaps in the Korean community and then the immigrant community as well.
Thank you, Gretchen.
So I will mute. Oh. Go ahead. I'm going to mute unless people ask me questions.
Perfect. I wanted to touch upon a couple of things that you mentioned because we're seeing them as well. Miranda and I have dealt with some language access issues, and we particularly deal with Spanish issues. We have had some issues getting Spanish language interpretation and technical assistance from the UI program. Eventually, when I brought it to the cabinet's attention, they were able to find one of the call center workers that they've hired to process these claims who did speak Spanish, and I think they were able to eventually reach out and help the contact we sent to them. But it's not really automatic where if someone gets on the line and they're speaking Spanish that they're going to be transferred to someone and have their issue dealt with in their language. So that's definitely something we have to keep tracking. I wanted to talk briefly. I was really disappointed in what you said about the One Louisville Fund and workers having to make a statement about getting assistance through that fund regarding their immigration, because I'd been privy to some conversations with the mayor's staff about the use of that fund, and really pushed hard because, like you said, those were donated funds and unrestricted funds, that we needed to prioritize that money for the groups who were not going to qualify under the more traditional or other types of relief that were being offered through the state. So I didn't know that about the statement, and I'm really disappointed about that. I also wanted to get to Min Son's question that you posted earlier about helping communities in the Korean community access benefits in UI, because we've dealt with that a lot within the Hispanic community, and you know, explaining these very technical programs in an easy way. We've certainly dealt with that, and probably my best advice is sort of what the governor says every day at 5 o'clock, which is, you know, if you think you're eligible, go ahead and apply, and make it as sort of as simple as that. Most people can't, you know, most English speaking people can fill out the unemployment questionnaire without legal assistance, and like we've talked about on this call, might need legal assistance later if an issue comes up. But it's really more technical language of you know, the dates of your work, the reason for leaving, which is mostly COVID related right now. So that's been sort of the most frequent box and to check, and really keeping it really simple as the governor is, of apply for benefits and we'll take care of the rest later. I think that's been something that's resonated in some of the communities that we serve. So just keep that in mind, and it is hard to penetrate sort of that fear and stigma that affects a lot of the groups and populations who we work with, and there are no easy answers for that. And if you have any more questions, we can definitely talk offline about that, because there's a lot there. And so I want to segue into this conversation. Gretchen did a great job talking about our backside workers.
Mackenzie,
Caitlin, yes.
can I chime in for a couple things before we move on?
Do it.
I just wanted to add to that I think that that's something that maybe we could be pushing for the Cabinet for Education and Workforce Development, to make the online UI like you can load the information in multiple languages because they have a Google Translate button on the page, but there's no way to do the application in Spanish even. And I think that's a huge need that would reduce the number of phone calls that they get. So I think that's something we can be pushing for. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that we're still seeing regular worker issues right now as well. Things like wage theft are still happening, and people are especially vulnerable to this kind of thing right now. You know, we've seen some workers who just did contract work, construction, remodeling type work. Some of that work is still going on, and some of the people contracting them aren't paying. And these workers are especially vulnerable because it's really hard to find any work right now. And so when you're not paid for the work you get, I just wanted to point out that that stuff is still happening. So it makes especially immigrant workers especially vulnerable because they're the people who are most often not paid for their work. And I also wanted to highlight, I think it was Min Sun brought up in a message in the chat about how people are afraid to apply for, immigrants are afraid to apply for public benefits because of implications for when they apply for permanent residence down the line. That's something that, it's the public charge rule that affects immigrants. There's a lot of confusion around it. And I'll post some links in the chat where people can get more information in multiple languages about public charge, but it doesn't affect people applying for citizenship. It only affects people applying for permanent residence or to enter the country. And unemployment insurance is not a benefit that would affect public charge because it's an earned benefit. So I did want to highlight that. There's a lot more I could say about public charge, but that's a whole nother conversation. And the only other thing I wanted to say here is that KJC, we've been in conversation with Ariana and with people at La Casita and several other folks, some of you are on the call, about we're going to start doing a survey of workers about what issues impact them the most in the workplace and also in the rest of their life, and what issues workers are concerned about and taking action on. And so we're going to be reaching out to some of your organizations for input on what a worker questionnaire what kind of questions it should include to make sure that we're going to be effectively asking questions of workers and getting good information through that project. So stay tuned for more on that, but thanks, Mackenzie.
No, thank you. Thank you, Miranda, for putting that into context within the public charge rule. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so I want to bring Caitlin Blair on our call. Caitlin works for UFCW Local 227 and is really been sort of in the middle of a lot of this advocating for workers, with meatpacking workers and grocery store workers, and we're incredibly lucky to have her on this call right now because she's been incredibly overwhelmed and busy, and I'm probably the most interested and excited about this discussion because I really want to hear, Caitlin, everything that your members have gone through and some of what you all have had to do to protect and advocate for them. So we are ready to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thank you for inviting me to share our experience over the last couple of months. And I'm really excited to see Debbie Berkowitz on the call because so much of her work has been important to what we have been trying to do as a union to advocate for our members. So Local 227 is one of the largest unions in the state of Kentucky. We represent Kentucky and Southern Indiana. While we have around 25,000 members in the area, about 16,000 of those work in grocery stores, primarily Kroger and Meijer. We have a small retailer in Paducah that we represent. And about 7,000 of those workers work in meatpacking plants. In our area, there's only one major processor that is non-union. That's the Purdue plant in Cromwell, Kentucky. Everybody else is a member of Local 227. And our workers have, we're seeing new kinds of frontline workers in this crisis that were never considered frontline workers before. And they are putting their health and safety at risk every single day. And they don't have a lot of the protections that other frontline workers do. So we immediately got to work talking with our employers about different safety standards and safety things that needed to be implemented. So I'll start with meatpacking and I'll move to grocery because they're kind of two separate groups that face very different challenges, and try not to get on a runaway train here. And Debbie, if you want to chime in at any time with the work that you guys are doing, it's so connected. But where we stand right now, and I know Debbie's going to talk about this more, is that OSHA, we say OSHA has failed to provide any kind of emergency enforceable standards for meatpacking and poultry processing plants, but quite frankly, it's really that they've refused. As we started to see positive cases spread through these plants, we saw meatpacking plants being shut down across the country, which meant that we had a reduction in the production capacity, primarily for beef and pork. So just to describe what it's like in a meatpacking plant, we have lines of hundreds of workers. The largest facility that we represent is the Tyson plant in Roberts, Kentucky, which is Henderson County. And there's about 1,400 workers if you include supervisors that stand anywhere. Most of the time, it's about 18 inches apart. And they're directly across from each other, and they're working with knives. That's a poultry plant. So the line speeds are around 140 birds a minute. And so, it's difficult to social distance on these lines and run the lines at the speeds that they're used to. The hallways tend to be small. So like at our JBS plant in Louisville, many of you may be familiar with, I know Mackenzie, you've visited with us before. The plant, the hallways are small. You've got thousands of people touching doorknobs and surfaces every single day. You may have, 30 to 40 workers in a hallway at JBS hanging up their normal PPE that they wear before they go into the break room. So a lot of what we've been working on is trying to get these companies to enforce social distancing where they can. Installing plexiglass barriers in between workstations and in the break rooms, providing PPE and layered PPE at that, because one of the things we've really struggled with here in Kentucky is getting actual PPE, because a surgical mask is technically not PPE, even though we kind of confuse that term. So we have been advocating with our employers to implement certain types of safety measures, but it's difficult because there's not a standard. So your experience in a meatpacking plant really is dependent on how serious your local management takes it, which is scary. Because, we have situations in like the Tyson plant or our JBS plant in Louisville where we do have escalating cases. And then we have our Smithfield plant in Middlesboro, Kentucky, where we haven't had a single positive test yet. So the experience is dramatically different. And that's why we need these enforceable standards, so that it shouldn't matter, where you work or, how your local community responded to this crisis. And Debbie, am I forgetting anything? I feel like it's a lot and I don't want to take up a ton of time, but we have asked the governor to make both meatpacking workers and grocery workers first responders and give them certain types of status, like better access to testing, a place in line for PPE, childcare for those who can come to work, and childcare is a barrier. We need them to be able to work, so we are in conversations with that. He did give childcare to the grocery workers. He hasn't done that for meatpacking workers, and we still don't have a place in line for PPE. And one of the things that, and really, I think a major reason that Gretchen and I connected was there's real concern because a large majority of our membership are immigrant and refugees, and under normal circumstances have a lot of barriers to accessing the healthcare system. And so getting them to access the testing that's available has been really difficult. And I know, talking to Representative Patty Minter in Bowling Green, one of the problems with the Purdue plant there, which is our plant that has had the highest number of positive cases, is that the testing wasn't accessible to workers. It was, they were doing testing in Warren County, but they were doing it on the other side of town. And so, and a lot of our immigrant and refugee members, we have entire families that work at these facilities. And so for our members, we were advocating for policies like, if you have somebody who is tested positive or sick in the home, that you also can have access to paid leave. And our understanding was that in some of the non-union employers, that was not happening. And so those workers were going to work, which is one of the things that spreads, it helps the spread, is when people are coming in asymptomatic and have been exposed. And because of the president's executive order, it feels like some of the safety of this particular group is being ignored in the name of the order. And so that's the newest battle that we're having to fight, is that the president's executive order requiring meatpacking plants to stay open does not absolve the company of their general duty under OSHA to provide a safe working environment. And I feel like I'm going on for a long time, so I want to shift to grocery really quickly, and sort of yank me off if I'm going too long, Mackenzie. But grocery is a very different.
I'm so into this conversation right now, so please keep going.
Okay, I could go on for a really long time. It's so grocery workers is an entirely different challenge, because they are exposed to large, volumes of the public. We're seeing stores, we represent stores that are seeing sales that they have never achieved in the entire existence of their store. Customer volume is through the roof. And so we have a number of things that are really concerning about the grocery industry. And, first and foremost is most of our, retailers have not done a good job of enforcing social distancing when it comes to customers and their employees. They are, marking things on the floors for customers to social distance from each other. But when it comes to the employees, for many customers, it's like they're invisible. So somebody's putting meat out on, in the case, and customers are reaching over them and touching them while they're trying to put this product on the case. So social distancing is also a problem in our grocery stores. And then a lot of our employers went ahead and self-imposed customer limits in their stores. To give you an idea of what that means, is, for the store that I shop at down the street, the customer limit at 50% was 200 people in the store at one time. There are only 92 parking spaces. So just to kind of let that sink in, is that the store limits were not enough, and they also weren't enforced. And then also now with masks, getting our customers to wear masks is increasingly becoming a political issue, not a safety issue. We had one of our stores in the Northeast, we had a customer break one of our members' arms because he asked him to wear a mask. And so it's becoming a dangerous situation to enforce a lot of this. So as we, go into Healthy at Work, our concerns are that we're going to see larger customer counts in our stores. Our members are going to be exposed even more than they currently have. And, to kind of deliver the 1-2 punch there, Kroger recently declared that we are returning to normal. And as of Saturday, ended the hero pay, the $2 an hour hero pay that they had given their workers. And so, we're also fighting that, kind of disconnect between, employers who are saying, oh, we're returning to normal because things are opening back up. When in fact, our members at all of our facilities are having their temperatures checked before they start their shifts. They're wearing masks all day. We're hearing from a lot of them that it's creating headache problems for them to be in those masks for an extended period of time. They're wearing gloves now. They've got plexiglass in the check lanes, and that is anything but normal. And so, those are some of the things, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will say, I talked to a young man who works at the Chenaway Kroger in Lexington last night, and he was saying, he works in the pharmacy. He was saying that a lot of the customers that he sees on a regular basis are elderly, and he was worried about them because he hadn't seen them in a while. They haven't been coming to the grocery store. They've been having family members fill their or pick up their prescriptions, and he was talking about how much he missed his customers and how much he loved his customers, and how he was his job was taking longer these days because when his regular customers that he hasn't seen in a while call in to fill their prescriptions, a lot of them haven't had interaction in a couple of weeks. And so he takes a little extra time to talk about gardening and, whatever it is that they want to talk about. So I just, the men and women that we represent are truly remarkable, and they've risen to the occasion in this crisis, and they inspire me every single day. I get a little emotional about it because they're not just my members, they've become my friends and my family. So thank you for letting me share. We appreciate it.
Gosh, you definitely ended on a good note there, and it is really really inspiring everything that we've been seeing, and a lot of us have been customers in the grocery stores recently, and having to navigate that area. And I drove by JBS last night actually, and saw people standing outside with their PPE and masks and sort of gown-like attire on as well. And I think Ben mentioned on our chat here, things are not changing as quickly as maybe some want, and that hero pay definitely should continue. And thank you for fighting on this on all of the aspects that you've had to fight for these workers on that. I think We had a question about construction workers, and I don't see Bill Finn or anybody on the call to answer that directly, but I do think construction has just now resumed. But you are definitely right that that is an industry that has a lot of immigrant workers that could probably use some outreach and probably a lot of issues there around social distancing as well. Minson had a question about that she has been working with a company to manufacture test kits and get those here, and how could she get those to vulnerable populations here? I know the city of Louisville has an executive order on that any kind of testing that groups want to do, you do kind of have to go through the city on that, and I could probably get you a copy of that order. Because we have had some not so legitimate businesses, I think maybe before this order was in effect, sort of get through the cracks on that. And the city has tried to act around that. I want to go ahead and get to Debbie, because it's, as Caitlin mentioned a couple times, it's the perfect segue into this conversation about OSHA standards and or the lack thereof, and so sort of how all of this is connected that we've all talked about so far: UI and people's ability to go back to work, whether they're going to feel safe at work, whether they've been safe at work, if they're frontline workers and have had to work. So much we could talk about there. Debbie, I'll let you sort of take it over.
Okay, thanks, Mackenzie, and it was great to hear from Caitlin. And so I'll just dive right in. But at NELP, I've just spent the last really full-time March, April, and now May. Just I feel like I'm yelling into the wind about that worker safety is in a crisis. And NELP has actually put out a bunch of reports on policies that states, governors, and legislatures and localities can implement to protect workers, because that's really what it's all about now. Caitlin started on this, but as many of you know, for 6 years, I was at OSHA under the Obama administration. I came from the UFCW. I was their health and safety director a long time ago, and now at the National Employment Law Project. And it's quite stunning, because in this pandemic, unlike most worker safety issues that really just affect the workplace, in this pandemic, if we don't protect the spread of COVID-19 at work, it's going to spread back out into the community. And meatpacking is the best example of this. In Kentucky, where you have meatpacking plants, and the Environmental Working Group put out a great map on Monday. In Kentucky, the communities where you have meatpacking plants have twice the rate of infection of any other counties in the country. And it's all because it started at work. It's because the meatpacking companies did not implement any of the basic CDC guidance of 6 feet apart, which is really critical. And JBS is still not doing that. And then, later on, when CDC put everybody in a mask, the meatpacking plants put nobody in a mask. They had people crowding into break rooms, locker rooms. People shift around a lot in meat plants when, people are out and they're reusing tools without any sanitation. Most meatpacking workers don't get the right to go to the bathroom once during the day because the line is so fast. So, we're supposed to wash our hands 10 times a day. So, I think, there's been a lot of racist lies about, this is spreading because of the way these people live. That is just a crock. It's all about it. They start in the meatpacking companies, and because they're all congregated, it's like what happened in nursing homes and nursing home patients. It's because the companies didn't implement policies. And you're sort of in an unprecedented situation here where the Department of Labor, OSHA, federal OSHA, has decided not to issue any specific requirements to any company to protect workers from COVID-19. There is no standards, there are no requirements. They could enforce the CDC guidance, but they don't want to do that, and so they're not doing it. So therefore, there is no requirements coming out of federal OSHA of how to protect workers from COVID-19. They have just started doing on-site inspections, and only in hospitals and only in fatalities. But of all the complaints that federal OSHA received, and I think it's almost 4,000, not one resulted in an on-site inspection. They made up a term called investigation, where a worker files a complaint that's signed, and OSHA doesn't respond with the on-site inspection, but responds with a letter to the employer saying, please self-investigate, and then let us know what you're doing. And then they close the case out when they get a letter back. So that's akin to doing nothing. And so therefore, it's really up to the states and the cities to pass laws and executive orders to implement, basic safety precautions. There's for healthcare, it's masks and triage, and nursing homes, it's getting them N95s and training and triage. But for all the other, workplaces, essential workplaces, which, as you know, and you've heard it here, are, disproportionately workers of color and immigrant workers, that the basic safety precautions for these workers is going to be, social distancing, required social distancing, and face masks are used to protect their source control, because so many people don't, have no symptoms when they're infected, and there is significant risk from infected individuals that are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, which is why temperature checks are sort of a placebo, because people are incredibly infectious when they have no symptoms, no temperature. So, which is why you want people to wear some kind of mask, as well as stepped up sanitation. So I noticed that Kentucky, your governor on I posted it here just last week, issued an executive order that actually does sort of require that workers be 6 feet apart, that they wear masks. It doesn't say they should provide masks, but I would hope that that's part of it. Because you have a state OSHA plan, Kentucky OSHA can enforce this. And this may be something you want to talk about, because Kentucky OSHA has no requirements right now. They're not doing anything. They have no specific mandates. But in Oregon, which is a state plan, and Nevada, like you are, the governors have issued executive orders. And like the state of Oregon just gave a meat processing plan a citation enforcing the governor's executive order for social distancing. They walked into that plant. They suited up. Every OSHA has, protective gear that they can use to come into a plant and protect their inspectors. And the two things I just want to say, one is there's an executive order on meatpacking. I just want to make it clear, it was bluster. It did not compel any plant to stay open. It did not allow anybody to have the authority to say to a plant that's closed, you have to open. It is bluster. And the executive order was just extended now to farms, agriculture, and fish processing. But if anybody wants any legal analysis of it, just let me know and I'll get it to you. But I just want you to know it's mostly bluster. It's giving these companies who are cronies of Trump, the ability to intimidate workers, intimidate their communities, and say we have to, keep producing meat. But, that's a false choice. You can keep workers safe, and you can feed America. It's not, one or the other. And the last thing I want to say is on unemployment insurance, with workers coming back, and if they're scared to come back to work because their companies haven't implemented 6 feet apart and no masks, that like in the state of North Carolina, the governor just, the Department of Employment Services just allowed that, when you go back on unemployment insurance, there, you can go back to work if the job is suitable for you. And if the job has changed from when you left it, one of the factors in whether a job is suitable is, one, do you have an underlying health condition? And that may mean that you can't interact with customers. But also, the DES said that workers don't have to go back if they feel that the company is not implementing, the CDC guidelines of social distancing and providing masks, and it would endanger their health, and they can continue getting unemployment insurance. So I just raced through things, but I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Debbie. You're certainly a great friend to this group, and have always been generous in and getting on and educating our group. I was on an email thread with you probably, I don't know how long ago because time doesn't exist anymore. You talked about how there had been no OSHA standards really directly related to the virus, but you did cite some OSHA standards in that email, trying to see if maybe if we needed to, for sort of litigation purposes, sort of piece together some that might fit. Could you mention those again?
Well, OSHA could cite and enforce the CDC guidelines under the general duty clause, but here in Kentucky, OSHA, they can just enforce the standards that your Kentucky governor, that somebody just posted a better link, sorry, than I did. But there's some, there's an OSHA standard that requires that employers provide bathrooms, and that employers provide hot and cold running water or tepid water and soap. So if employers are not even doing that, and we've heard from a lot of workplaces that they're out of soap, they're out of this, that's a standard that's violated. Yeah, and there's also, OSHA has like a basic sanitation standard that's sort of like, that does require bathrooms and requires hot and cold water, and says that, workplaces have to be sanitary. They usually, you sort of mean that you can't have garbage lying around and you can't make people walk through puddles, but, you could expand the scope, you can, try to get, workers have to reuse tools and they're not sanitizing them, or workers are opening the same doorknob or punching it on the same clock, and that's just not sanitary. That's I don't know what it is in Kentucky, but it's 1910-141 federally, 29 CFR 1910-141. That's what happens when you're a regulator. You know all this, right?
Debbie, I wanted to ask you about something we're seeing here. We had an Amazon worker whose partner was diagnosed with COVID, and I think for any other employer under 500 people, the new CARES Act provisions regarding leave would be triggered there. He called the employer. He asked for he disclosed, that his partner had been infected. He'd been caring for someone with the virus. And they said, okay, we might give you some time off, bring us some proof. He shows up to work when the next time he was scheduled, brings the proof, and was told that he was not welcome back there and was terminated. Do you know of anything that we can help him or anybody else on the call?
So he was terminated because his partner was infected with COVID-19?
Yes.
That sounds like a violation of like the ADA or something. Mm-hmm. Because
I've been trying to think of some more traditional routes like ADA to think about, but really anybody else for 500 and under employees would be covered under the leave provisions that were in the Families First Act, but I'm just not sure about, because he works for someone with 500 or more employees.
So unfortunately, we have a really horrible federal government right now. And so CDC actually weakened its guidance for essential workers, which the warehouse workers were, that said that if you've been exposed to someone with COVID-19, that the company can require you to come back to work. And as long as they give you a mask and a temperature check. And I want you to know, like Mike Pence, right? He was exposed and he had a quarantine, and Anthony Fauci quarantined, but no, it's other essential workers. So in New York and in Minnesota and some other health departments, they rejected this from CDC. So you're gonna wanna get your state health department, your governor to, because if you weren't an essential worker and you were just exposed to someone COVID-19, they want you to quarantine. But if you're an essential worker, then you could go back to work, and that's insane, and that's going to spread the disease around. So I think that to protect workers, you really want workers who've been exposed to be able to stay home and self-quarantine and not go back to work. I think that's one of the reasons it spread in meatpacking, is they required everybody to come back, even if they didn't even tell them when they were exposed at work. And And then they incentivize people to come back, even if they're sick. So, you know, can you also let me know about that case? Because I'd like to take that to the press. That's just outrageous.
Yeah.
And Amazon is wealthier than God, you know, so yeah.
And
Yeah, let's
unfortunately,
definitely talk more about that.
unfortunately, in the Healthy at Work order, the language around providing any kind of paid leave in these types of situations says employers are encouraged to provide this. So it's not that they're required, and you know that word matters. So that's an unfortunate part of the Healthy at Work order.
Get it changed.
Debbie, I wanted to bring up one more issue with you that has been sort of gnawing at me. On the flip side of OSHA and protecting workers while they're at work, then you have workers who are then exposed and infected with the virus and have, you know, varying lengths of recovery. Are there workers and states that are these workers' comp eligible type claims, and how are people proving that they contracted the virus at work?
So your governor was one of the first to come out and say that for healthcare workers and first responders, it just, if they get COVID-19, it's presumed that it's at work. California, a governor actually just extended it to anybody that's working outside the home, because otherwise, as with all occupational illnesses, companies can test it all the time under workers' comp. I mean, you know, the studies that workers now, if you're sick at work, that only 20% of your costs now are covered by comp, because companies can test it all the time and ended up on, you know, the worker pays for it. So either the governor should expand, like to cover meatpacking workers, retail workers, essentially any essential workers, and you should put pressure on him, because he was one of the first governors to have healthcare workers and first responders covered as a presumption under workers' comp, because otherwise you're going to fight it case by case, because as with any illness, the company says it's not work related. So maybe there's a way to come up with something with the governor. If there's more than 2 or 3 cases in a workplace or something like this, you know, then it's work related, otherwise you're going to be fighting it, as all occupational disease cases are like. It's much easier to get something where you've actually been injured right in front of other employees, and they know, okay, well, you've got your finger cut off right there. So that's a good question.
Yeah, I've been really curious about that. Does anybody else have questions for Debbie while I monopolize her time and ask questions? There's been a lot of activity on the chat, but I don't think anything directly addressed to Debbie's presentation.
Well, Caitlin just corrected that grocery workers are included, which is great in the governor's executive order, but not meatpacking. Yeah.
Yeah, and Debbie, I have a question. I had talked to Robin Robbins about this, did I read correctly in the CDC guidance that OSHA is basically giving their investigators discretion as to whether the employer made a good faith effort to communicate safety and health information in other languages?
So OSHA's not enforcing anything, but the CDC guidance that put out was all written with consider this, if possible, if feasible, ideally. So right.
So any employer who says, Belinda was saying this the other day in the department, any employer who says that they're following all CDC guidelines, for everybody on this call, that's a meaningless statement, because of exactly what Debbie just said. Every provision has if possible, if feasible. So just sort of keep that on your radar as employers talk about in the press, you know, how great they are. And also always beware of employers who are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars thanking their workers. It's not for their workers.
Right, and do all this press release. I just want to tell you something else, just to tell you how corrupt the CDC is, and that is like one of the reports they did of Smithfield meatpacking plants. I got a tip from one of the authors of that report at CDC that the industry actually pushed back against the report and lobbied everybody, including the White House and the Secretary of Agriculture, who told the Secretary, who told Redfield, who's the head of CDC, that they had to weaken the report and put those words in, like, consider this, if it's possible, if it's feasible, ideally in every single sentence. So it's, you know, the industry's writing its own guidance, and it's really corrupt. So I just wanted to tell you that as well. Is it November yet? Yeah.
We're going to get there.
This is Miranda. I just want to let people know, I mean, it's past noon already, so everything's going to be recorded. If you have to jump off, we'll be sending out the recording by tomorrow.
I have to jump on another call, but it was so great. Thank you for inviting me. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Debbie. So good to see you.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
So now that that Debbie's had to leave and Miranda's right, anyone else who has to leave, that's certainly fine, because that's, you know, most of our at least policy related and presentations. But we did want to get into, I hope everybody's had some time to think about announcements, anything that they want to say about anything new that their group is doing, or meetings like this that we can get on and support your work. I want you all to be able to come off mute and announce that.
And afterwards, you can also be sharing announcements on the list, on the email list.
We also have on the agenda to bring up potential topics for our next meeting, and I think what, you know, I'll just comment on that if while you all are thinking about that. You know, this virus really doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. We probably will. I don't know what the date is for our next meeting. Ben's done a great job this year of scheduling all our task force meetings, and we have target dates in advance, and that we don't want to move too much, but would move if it conflicted with a large event that was going to take away from some of our participation. I think what we'll see in the future, you know, maybe we'll have another federal stimulus package that might have provisions that impact some of the topics we discussed today, that we might need to revisit that discussion. And that would certainly be important. You know, normally today in this discussion, we would have had discussion about the most recent legislative session. So, you know, we haven't even scratched the surface there. And so, you know, that's a potential topic for discussion. And I really think, you know, the topics, at least employment related for discussion, are going to be UI and safety. Also getting back to, as more companies reopen and are, you know, maybe their workforce looks a little different. I know Miranda and I have dealt with some issues with employees coming back from closures, and maybe the employer wanting to change their pay or change their hours, and how people and workers are affected by that, and some possible, you know, whether that triggers any like legal causes of action. We're going to be sort of looking for that. You know, we've seen less wage claimants, but I suspect that's going to be again on the uptick over the next few months. So you're probably going to see some more employment related issues creep up the more people are going back to work, and maybe UI is still an issue, and maybe some of this data and payment issues that we talked about earlier. We'll have somebody to sort of clarify those, and then also be talking about issues as groups reopen. That's sort of what I've been thinking, but I'm interested if anybody else has thought of an announcement they want to make, or has any contribution to the discussion on what we could talk about in our next meeting.
Well, with respect to the next meeting, what I would say is, you know, we have traditionally done 3 or 4 task forces a year, but this is not a traditional year. And I really want to encourage everybody still on the call to request trainings and information. We can do Zoom calls anytime, and it can be a 1-hour thing in between task forces. We're moving fast, and there's a lot at stake for a lot of people. So if there are questions that you have, if there are trainings you need, that's part of the reason KEJC exists in the state, is to convene these sorts of groups. And so don't be shy. There are no wrong requests. If we don't have time or if there's not demand, we'll tell you that, you know. But really, we need to know from you all what you're seeing and what you need from us.
Thank you, Ben.
Hey, Mackenzie, this is Gerald.
Hey.
I've got a possible, when would your next workers force task meeting be, approximately?
I need to look.
August 13th is when we schedule the next one, but as Ben said, it may be appropriate to have shorter calls between now and then.
Sure. The reason I was asking is I'm possible good topic, and I don't know if you could get somebody from the labor cabinet to do it or not, but the budget cuts that the labor cabinet has had to already take and probably going to take with the downfall in the economy, and it would be interesting to see how that's going to impact them, especially with their high profile in workers' comp issues, wage issues, workers' claims issues. I think that's going to impact the labor cabinet significantly with their budget cuts, and they're really going to be high profile during all of this.
You are so right about that, Gerald. If in case anybody isn't aware of this, you know, because again, we didn't talk about the legislative session like we probably ordinarily would have. The labor cabinet, basically the legislature passed a budget very similar to the past 2 years of spending. But the labor cabinet's budget specifically was cut, and I'm not sure if on top of that, I assume they are a part of what the governor is asking for, the 12.5% cuts across the board for state agencies. So they're probably getting hit twice, and you know, they are the agency responsible for administering our state OSHA program and investigating claims of wage theft. So I think that's a really important discussion, Gerald.
They are also manning the hotlines. They're working long shifts manning those hotlines too.
Well, one thing to consider, I think there's a way of marrying those budget cuts up with something else that I was interested in following up with. If there's a work group for making recommendations along the lines of what Debbie Berkowitz suggested, you know, I'm going to have to go back and listen again to all of the different ways she articulated that Kentucky could differentiate itself from OSHA's, you know, quote unquote guidance or whatever. But it sounds like there's a lot of things that states can do independently to protect people, and we could even frame up the necessity of those changes and protections in the light of the budget cuts, so that the governor can say, look, if we were able to investigate all of these places, we might be able to do something different. But as a result of budget cuts, we just have to establish a presumption that if you got sick at work, or if you got COVID, you got it at work. And that's the presumption for workers' comp, because we don't have the ability to inspect and enforce all of these regulations because of the budget cuts.
Professor Levinson mentions you know, in the CARES Act, and we covered a lot of the UI provisions, but did not cover the new leave provisions. So that's definitely something that we could cover in the future and talk more about. Anyone else, announcements or ideas for how we could make this group more useful for you, whether it's meeting sooner, training on a particular topic, or including a potential topic in our next meeting? Well, even if you don't want to speak up right now, you can put something in the chat. You can email one of us, and we'll certainly be happy to talk to you about that. Miranda, do you have anything else to, anybody else have anything to bring up before we close?
I'm just going to paste my email into the chat. You all should already have it, but just in case you don't, you can send additional topics to go into more depth to my email or to the list.
Again, we did go a little bit over today, but we had some really great discussion, and I especially want to thank Caitlin and Debbie and everyone who was able to present and join us. This was one of our bigger meetings, and I wish we had been able to meet in person and have lunch together and have the meeting that we typically have. I hope those of you who were new to this meeting or haven't been to as many of our meetings in the past found it useful and want to come back, because we want you to be a part of this discussion, especially our legal aid community that sees a lot of our legal issues and are sort of the lawyers on the front lines. We really appreciate you being on, and you know, just look for Miranda's email about our next meeting, and we'll try to make it as good as this one was today. So thank you all so much.